Hello everyone, today we talk about the consequences of the Concordat of Worms in the Eastern Frankish, essentially the German kingdom. We have already discussed the whole deal, let's say, of the investitures struggle, and I haven't created a playlist, but you can check that out in the Holy Roman Imperial and also the Christian history, medieval Christianity one actually. And yet we haven't gone in depth with it, nor today we will do it. It's just a reflection, however, on the essentially privatization and feudalization of the episcopal and abbatial investitures in the same Germany. You know that after the Concordat of Worms, essentially the emperor and the pope agreed to essentially claim the right of investiture over the clergy, respectively, in the kingdoms of Germany and the kingdom of Italy. And this was just a compromise because, as you know, the rivalry between the imperial and papal prerogatives went on for a long time. It was never settled, fundamentally. And so we would think, by the way, that such division would, however, provide with each contended with a full control of events in their respective spheres of influence, let's say. But things were much more complicated by many factors, including the same secular and ecclesiastical allegiance that varied in the respective kingdoms. Naturally, the main problem was an imperial one, as the papacy had a smaller dominion, while the emperor in theory had not just the Germany, Italy. Gradually the influence was mostly over the surroundings, right? Bohemia, Burgundy. In part, yes, he claimed some suzerainty on Denmark, on Hungary. There were other kingdoms that would recognize the imperial the imperial domination in depending on the political convenience. This could be just a formal one. As a matter of fact, I made a video about it was from last summer. It was Holy Roman Empire, ideology, politics, things like these. You'll find it in the playlist as well. That discusses a bit what were the actual limits of the empire from a political and territorial point of view. But paradoxically, some of the greatest problems of the Germanic emperors were in Germany itself, because the country had fundamentally lagged behind historically compared to others like France or Italy in terms of public development, right? The properly of levels of centralization, urbanization, literacy, all these things. And at this point, as you know, we are at the beginning of the 12th century. Things had not really changed much from the previous, from the times of the so-called ethnic duchies, that by this point were not really, ethnic just because the locals spoke different languages or much of an ethnic continuity of the elites. As a matter of fact, at this point, the Eastern Frankish kingdom was already enucleated as such, right, considered as an entity per se. Its boundaries had been fixed. There had been in the previous centuries the attempt to surpass this ducal rule in order to consolidate a real monarchy that, as you know, in Germany was mostly a process catalyzed by the Ottonian dynasty, which managed through the Saxon military power and the Franconian material one to secure an important continuity of the royal institutions of the kingdom that had emerged, as you know, from the Carolingian partitions of the mid-9th century, and to, in fact, carry on eventually what was the Renovatio Imperii with the Ottonian conquest of Italy, and so the consolidation also at an ideological level of a true Romanity of the empire that since Carolingian times had not been stressed more than much. It was considered mostly like a Frankish thing. And therefore a process of statalization also drew, of course, and that was the main deal in many ways, from the Roman administrative tradition, the skilled personnel, in the sense, the prestige and the grandeur of the same control of Rome. And this had brought paradoxically to the creation of the same ideological sap that would have eventually fueled, paradoxically, the Gregorian reforms against the emperors, because the Ottonian motivation for stripping the ecclesiastical appointment, the investiture, from the local nobility, so the secular power, was in fact justified on the basis of the fact that they were the highest secular power. And so the idea was to keep the local elites away from ecclesiastical policy that would have had allegedly to be just a purely spiritual matter, right? Instead, basically what the Ottonians did, as was appointing in that moment the same popes. Actually, in other lands, they never could fully do the same thing. They mostly, even the same imperial success was owed to a condescendence, let's say, of the elites in Germany, in Italy, to consolidate a broader power, but just through the appointment, imperially recognized appointment of the elites that already ruled, right? Very famous is the bishop-counts policy, especially in Italy, where bishops basically already ruled from the cities. So when the Ottonians came, they wanted to control these strategic centers. They would just reinvest the local prelates of not just with their own prerogatives, but also adding the comital title to them. But it was a clever move, because the clergy could not inherit. The clergy at this point got married, had children, but by ecclesiastical rule, they could not pass it down to their biological heirs, right? It was mostly an elective thing within the same church. It happened as well, but in that way, the Ottonians could circumvent the appointment of a secular authority that could claim some kind of inheritance right on a biological base. And this broader success that had brought to the Germanic emperors to be recognized in these lands as the legitimate rulers, also as guardians during the period of the second invasions, were put down as kind of checkers of Byzantine expansionism in southern Italy, etc., as a broader consolidating force, had undergone a severe crisis with the, in fact, investiture struggles, when this power was seen as to have become excessively threatening for the local autonomies. And the same church carried out this extraordinary series of reforms. It was a gradual process, right? It was not even teleologically let's say, scoped properly, not even at the time of Gregory VII, that gives the name to the series of reforms, because he kind of initiated them. But his death, nobody thought that those things would have gone on. There were more important popes later on that made the thing. And this brought to a severe break, right, in the broader universal system in Western Europe, so that even of course, when this happened under the Franconian dynasty, that as soon as it was excommunicated by the papacy because of these very kind of wall against wall conflict, so the rise of the German nobility against them. That, of course, as soon as the emperor was excommunicated, all the vassals would start, would feel completely unrestrained from any kind of regulation, would start taking over the public goods and going at the detriment of probably what could have been, at that point, the creation of a national monarchy with a functional state. Now, this aspect is, in some ways, let's say, in its consequence, some in some ways debatable, meaning that Germany had great difficulties to put things together. But it is true that the country, in a way, was so backwards that it had not developed even properly a full feudal reality. Right? In France, things had gone worse in terms of political fragmentation because feudalism had began earlier, because it was simply there were more resources, more inhabitants, more nobility, and in this sense it was easy, especially during the second invasions, for the local elites to take over and to become something more robust, starting from the bottom up. Germany was ravaged by the Magyars. There was a big deal of difficulty and militarization, mostly of the eastern border since Carolingian times against the Slavs, in fact, the Magyars, etc. And there was no, let's say, powerful enough feudality, let's say, to catalyze a major institutional development like it would succeed in the 12th century, like in England or in France, where feudalism were more developed. This because the German middle classes were stronger in relative terms. They definitely weren't particularly prosper, but in the broader political institutional balance, it was more difficult for the nobility to take over. Right? This had been engineered socially since Carolingian times, but again, there were not enough resources to centralize from paradoxically from that privatistic base, as it would happen instead in those other countries that, yes, were so hyper-feudal and private, but at the same time were the first places where such compaction could, as a glue, let's say, could lay basis for some kind of further centralization, as it happened in France, etc. In Germany, this wouldn't happen. Therefore, it was easier, paradoxically, in centuries like the 12th, it would have been, at least, if these other incidents had not occurred, to, let's say, to structure, in fact, a political institutional system that could stem the push of the nobility, in a way. This was, let's say, unfeasible on the grounds of the fact that the nobility, still as in any post-Carolingian kingdom, was the force that ruled the country, right? But even this nobility was smaller, so again, there was no real public culture in a way, but at least there was still not that a incredible feudal private capacity that the German princes would assume, starting especially from the 13th century, would make the entire monarchic system basically collapse as such. So the defeat against the papacy with the Concordat of Worms, that saw the Holy Roman Emperors giving up their own prerogatives in Italy, that was their first objective, would come in 30 years to be, right, the target of Frederick Barbarossa of the Hohenstaufen. It was the obvious place where to start, again, we have explained very often, to centralize the empire from, brought turmoil in Germany. And in a time in which, like the 12th century, the economy, the demographics were kind of developing fast, so very often also out of control of the central institutions for the few that they could do, indeed, especially in this context. And so we can observe how, from the ecclesiastical standpoint, the Concordat of Worms didn't quite confer the German sovereigns a greater grip on their own clergy, right? That would go on for half a century, especially under the Hohenstaufen, at least before their end, because, like in other countries, the bishops, that were already quite powerful, especially the one of the Rhineland, etc., would see, in fact, in this rise of privates, a threat to them. So by backing the monarchy, they thought they could back a public power that would somehow manage to counter the push of the nobility. As you know, with the Hohenstaufen, there is there was already, from the side, as a broader policy from the side of the German kings, the employment of the ministeriales, of these knights serfs that are basically characteristic of Germany in medieval Europe, that since were not freemen, but they were kind of warlike, and they were kind of representative of that kind of average German, say, I can't say middle class, but you could say this people that had remained as communities kind of relatively autonomous, even if in Germany the prevalent mentality and the factuality was that the nobility actually controlled people, right? It was traditionally in Germany, contrarily to what you would think, such an idea of freedom anymore, right? This thing had quickly ended, conceptually speaking, right? The fact that the middle classes were kind of more autonomous in political terms still up to this point doesn't mean that they were considered as free, right? In Germany, if you were somebody, you were under somebody, right? This is different from other traditions, like in the Italic kingdom, people were traditionally free, right? Since Roman Longobards times, was so that the ministeriales would be armed on behalf of the say properly to fight, to serve the king, the emperor, as extremely effective and brutal fighters to watch the nobility, to keep it at bay, right? They tried. This was carried out especially by the Hohenstaufen, and almost successfully, right? If they hadn't lost further against the Lombard League, etc., and triggered this other crisis and also their dynastic problems, Frederick II minority, and that's where the wall system was the last thing it could take, right? As a strain, that's where things began to collapse, right? So that the young Frederick already gave up its own, prerogatives to the princes, right? In large amount, to start to build mostly from a private base and not a public anymore. So the Concordat of Worms is this massive blow that you can look at in the mid, fundamentally, 12th century, because the 30 years that followed were of complete turmoil. Frederick I was basically the first ruler that managed to, let's say, compact Germany because of his double lineage from the Welfen and the Hohenstaufen at the same time, and that managed to carry out an effective rule, because the same German princes had realized at that point that the country was falling apart, right? But what happened in the meanwhile was surely difficult to invert, to recover as a tendency. So, in fact, in the same decades after the Concordat of Worms, what we see among the clergy is that the royal concession of the royalties, properly, to the regalia, right, to the bishops and abbots, ended up to be interpreted within the empire, but especially in the kingdoms of Germany and Burgundy, so north of the Alps, as a feudal investiture. This is crucial. So this is an investiture that had as correspective the homage and the oath of fealty, and having as object the temporal power of the prelate. And before the Concordat, it had happened in many cases that the prelates would owe the king in the empire, as in the other Western kingdoms, an oath and an homage, but this in relation to the royal concession of the episcopal and of the abbey, without, in this sense, reducing through such act the episcopal. Albeit for the abbey it happened sometimes, but that's another thing, because it was more kind of a private thing. In the figure of a fief, because the concession was the conferment of a religious dignity. So this was done just in the name of the supreme responsibility of the king on his kingdom in any sphere of activity, without conceiving as a fief the temporal power conferred to the prelate, given that this power was considered on the base of the royal diplomas of concession in allowed of goods and rights to the churches as a property of the same churches that was sacred and undividable from the ecclesiastical entity, right? So you understand the massive watershed of this change, because the interpretation, the feudal interpretation of the concession of the royalties represented the formal integration of the temporal power of the prelates in a juridical frame of feudal character that exactly at that time in the 12th century was also clarifying in other kingdoms. I think that the same it had happened in the same Holy Roman Empire in 1037 with Conrad II in Pavia with the Edictum de Beneficis, the recognition of the essentially the inheritability of the minor fiefs. That is, after Quercy in 867, if I'm not wrong, what Charles the Bold had, properly allowed the inheritance, the inheritability of the great fiefs, so the larger fiefs. Now, it was kind of evident already in Franconian time, the beginning of Franconian times, that the control on the lesser fiefs was practically impossible as well, or at least it had to be recognized as a right. Their inheritability had to be recognized as a right, so that paradoxically now the emperors could use the lesser vassals to counter the power of the larger ones, right? At the end of the 9th century, that had the inheritability of the larger fiefs was necessary to control the bigger chunks of the Carolingian Empire, and the local clienteles too, hopefully. At this point, the feudal fragmentation had after the 10th century had taken such a large scale that controlling the larger vassals was becoming ever more difficult, and therefore, if you allowed the smaller vassals the inheritability of their land, you could essentially allow them to turn to you as a sovereign and say, look, if there is a bigger vassal who's bullying me, and because he wants my own land, now you told me that it's my right to inherit it as a private possession, and therefore we can be allied against that. And this tells you naturally how depleted, right, the entire public authority had been already by that point in the secular field. Now we're talking about properly the secular ones. This was 1 century before the Concordat of Worms. The churches up to that point had remained instead like a public thing in theory, right? In especially north of the Alps, they had always been somewhat connected to a private reality, because the secular authority had been essentially private. There had been never kind of a real public force, right? Everything had been done by channeling these clienteles into wars of conquest and so on. That's how the Carolingian Empire had been built. But after that, after it stopped, you know how it ended, right? They started eating each other. And the churches, in that sense, were often seen also as this kind of, say, being under some kind of power, even when they were, of course, under the power of the same clergy, meaning that there were quite powerful bishops and abbots that were also men of war, etc. But especially in a country like Germany, as we've seen, where feudalism had not spread to the extreme consequences simply because they lacked properly the resources of carrying it out. Paradoxically, the ecclesiastical policy, especially after the Renovatio Imperii carried out by the Ottonians, had been seen as a major opportunity to invest in as a public power, like the imperial one, to avoid the dispersion of the the same public assets among the privates, that now had been fully granted, starting from that Italic edict of Conrad II, to all, even the smaller vassals, right? And what is fascinating there is that, also talking about the aforementioned boundaries of the empire, what the emperor issued, right? That was a Germanic emperor issuing it in the Italic capital, but would, first of all, it's not that it was issued in the sense that somebody was obeying for making the dynamic happen, right? The dynamic had already happened, and that now was just the political attempt to recognize the prerogatives of the smaller vassals, to tie them more to the higher cause. So always the king that goes past the high nobility, that is the greatest problem that it has very often, to look at the lower strata. That's, as we were saying before, also the ministeriales represent, not just in the imperial army, but also in the ecclesiastical. Well, in fact, this is particularly even in Swabian times, the majority of, of the knights of Frederick Barbarossa were not just ministeriales, but they came from the ecclesiastical clienteles, right? Because the same clergy at that point was framed within the empire's attempt in the Kingdom of Germany to preserve this kind of say more public reality, a less privatized reality, like the church could be, right, in favor of the same emperor. Eventually, this thing properly didn't. It came out of control, as since the beginning of the 13th century, you see great bishops like the one of Cologne, Adolf of Altena, that start essentially not making pro-imperial policy anymore, just they make their own, right, depending on the situation. But these centuries that, and so under Swabian times, things had more or less worked because of, again, the forces had been channeled in the re-expansion of the empire in Italy, with the attempt of reuniting East and West, controlling the Mediterranean. So something that these elites were kind of saying, okay, we'll do that, right? Especially the clergy, whereas the majority, especially of the German secular power, said, we're not really interested to go fight and die in Italy for something that seems too costly and too hotly pursued in a way, stubbornly pursued. That's all another thing, and of course they would have done it if they had been the kings themselves, but for that point they would have preferred just to remain in Germany and seizing any opportunity to go out, to eat something from the public assets if they could, with their retinues and all. And that the situation between papacy and empire kept being tormented, so there were excommunications every once in a while, so that was a good chance. But what is crucial about what we've just read in the decades following the Concordat of Worms is that fundamentally what was seen originally as the normal homage and act of respect and loyalty in general of the ecclesiastical elites to the emperor, just as a cooperative coexistence between the secular authority and the ecclesiastical, the spiritual one, was becoming essentially a feudal connection. That is to say, by essentially making an oath of allegiance and an homage in order to receive this benefit, this ecclesiastical goods in fief, you don't have actually a recognition of a greater royal power. Quite the contrary. What the clergy was telling is that their own goods, their own dioceses, their own abbeys, and so on, were something that they were beginning to retain as a private possession in the same guise which existed for the secular elites. So in a way or another, these goods were privatizing. These clergy were seigneurializing. Let's say, I don't know, the abbot of Fulda was said to have 20,000 men under his control, right? And so this tells you essentially what even the same clergy was transforming itself like. This is radically important because, first of all, it shows in fact, the radical privatization even of the ecclesiastical institutions that had been mostly the best horse on which the emperors had historically bet for stemming privatization in the empire. And also it shows how impacting the same Concordat of Worms had been in this dynamic, because it happened fundamentally immediately afterwards, and it had to do properly the same investitures that the German sovereigns had salvaged for their own kingdom, that were instead turning private in juridical, institutional, administrative practice, right? So this meant that the same church that was again generally supportive of the imperial cause in the decades that, especially after Frederick Barbarossa, etc., shows how they were already starting essentially to reasons to have this allegiance, but in a much more autonomous way than what it had been the case since mostly Ottonian times, we could say. This also corresponds to the broader socio-economical developments of the country, because Germany was modernizing, was essentially from the mid 12th century, it witnessed mostly at the hands of the Swabians the import of Western Frankish feudalism in its full guise. So this would obviously privatize further the system. But one could speculate on how, if the emperors had won the investiture struggle, which would have been an enormous thing historically in Western history, the same possibilities, let's say, of the German kingdom to develop in a more public and concrete and cohesive and centralized direction would have actually reached. Right, because again, as we've seen, the system was not very well versed for any kind of solid institutional architecture at that point. But definitely, an imperial success would have strengthened the political institutions in the country, and it would have probably not allowed even such institutions to like the church to be privatized in the conferment of its own property in as such, right? And this is again the interesting aspect, because it's a change in mindset of the same church. These are not just imperial helpers or just a spiritual force or some kind of, also very often of intelligentsia could work in the administration, something from their schools, etc. These are powerful individuals who start behaving exactly as lords, right? They had kind of already done it because the differences had been blurred, right, since the beginning in these places, but there was a decisive turn from their side as well, right? And this explains what would happen again in another half a century, when this same ecclesiastical principalities began to take literally an autonomous direction from imperial policy altogether, sometimes even contrasting it in a way. But times changed fast. In fact, this is a feature of Germany, that countries like Germany, England, developed in relative terms much faster than, say, more like richer places like France or Italy during the Middle Ages, right? So that what happened, especially in Germany during the 12th century, was an enormous growth, right? So imagine this when it happens when it's unregulated. And this is, interestingly enough, the story of so many different realities, even close to us, right? Evaluate always this in the history of a country, not much how they are rich, let's say in absolute terms, but how regulated that system is, how fast it happened, from which background they came. And you can discover some of the most important differences properly in just not in the mentality that has been formed, but in mentality that pre-existed in a way. And it's obvious that this transformation, as we were saying before, as properly the fortune of the feudal institution in this, it was a young reorganization of public power within kingdoms that had emerged with some difficulty right after the second invasion period, etc., when privatization was becoming kind of the normality in the institutional processes. Right, the 12th century is the same. I made a video on it. Century of probably the birth of the feudal monarchies, right? Meaning that even kings, properly to the top, were properly part of a feudal competition, right? From which, paradoxically, however, exactly in this century, the main fact that the monarch emerges as a force that is capable of centralizing in some fashion further. And naturally, this depends, as we were saying before, also on the different degree in which this happened in the various kingdoms. And we will observe it naturally also for other countries. But again, the build up that the German monarchy had managed to preserve, importantly, as an orderly force, especially in the 10th century, or the beginning of the 11th, probably before the investiture controversy, was in a sense crippled by the loss in the defeat in that confrontation. And this is what would trigger that kind of quasi-national frustration, frankly, that in Germany developed, especially after the 30 years without a stable monarch as a consequence of this settlement, that would bring later on, would manifest itself with Frederick Barbarossa in Italy against the papacy, and in the attempt properly to recompact the imperial power in the peninsula. That was, as you know, a very bloody and long struggle, which ultimately failed yet again. So these are big issues because you can see them historically as also the trigger of other mechanisms that were evident even by the 14th century, the 15th century, eventually even with Luther and with the general, in a completely different situation, of course, especially mindset and culture. The times had already really deeply changed, right? But in a secular, modern sense, but still having within their veins these broader issues that in a way had never quite been solved, right? This is say overlapping the empire papal struggle, the even certain national contraposition, but it's still remaining, however, aware of the fact that the universality of power for both papacy and empire, and for the communities that were involved in their policy, were always also a gluing factor, right? And that, as I always say, that the investiture controversy was one of the single most powerful as overlooked Western civilization makers ever, right? Without this confrontation, it would have not been much what we consider properly as Westerner, and it's difficult to sometimes picture this adequately, because again, it's exactly in the 12, in this the 11th, the 12th, the 13th century. This thing was defined very strongly and also very broadly, but still with properly a worldview and also broader ideological, juridical, or administrative and military effort, which didn't really find an equivalent, in my opinion, in the broader in Europe at that time. Right, I can't think of any in terms of impact eventually in a moral sense, in a civilizational sense, but we will see it perhaps on another occasion. For now, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. See you next time. Bye.